What's up, history lovers? Welcome back to Epic Renaissance. Today, we're delving into the darkest moments of the Renaissance. But before we start this journey into Renaissance darkness, make sure you hit that subscribe button and hit that notification bell because you don't want to miss a single episode of the most scandalous, brutal, and downright shocking stories from history's most fascinating period. So today, dear viewer, pour yourself a goblet of something strong, bolt your doors, and prepare yourself for the top 10 darkest moments of Renaissance history. At number 10, we meet the man who inspired the world's most famous vampire. But trust me, the real Vlad Dracula was far more terrifying than any fictional bloodsucker. Vlad III of Wallachia, a region in what is now Romania, didn't just rule through fear, he turned cruelty into performance art that would make modern horror directors quit their jobs. His father, Vlad II, was a member of the Order of the Dragon, which gave him the surname Dracul, meaning dragon or devil. Dracula is his son's name, meaning son of the dragon or son of the devil. Born around 1431, Vlad earned his nickname Tepes, the Impaler, through his favorite method of execution, and boy did he perfect it. We're not talking about quick, merciful deaths here. Vlad's impaling technique was designed to keep victims alive for hours, sometimes days, as they slowly slid down a sharpened stake. His most infamous dinner party took place in 1459, when he invited Saxon merchants to feast with him. The twist? The dining hall was surrounded by hundreds of impaled victims, creating a forest of human suffering. Vlad reportedly ate his meal while listening to the groans and death rattles of the dying. One guest who complained about the smell found himself impaled on a particularly tall stake, so he wouldn't have to smell the others. But Vlad wasn't just randomly cruel, he was strategically psychotic. When Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II sent envoys who refused to remove their turbans in his presence, citing religious customs, Vlad had the turbans nailed to their skulls. His message to the Sultan: you can keep your customs permanently. The numbers are staggering. Vlad is estimated to have killed between 40,000 and 100,000 people during his relatively short reign. After one particularly successful campaign against Ottoman forces, he created a forest of the impaled, stretching for miles, 20,000 corpses arranged in perfect geometric rows. The psychological warfare worked. Ottoman soldiers would reportedly vomit at the sight of his battlefields, and entire armies would retreat rather than face the impaler. Vlad's reign of terror ended in 1476 when he was killed in battle, but his legend was just beginning. Within decades, stories of his cruelty had spread across Europe, eventually inspiring Bram Stoker's Dracula. The irony? The fictional vampire was actually less monstrous than the real man. Coming in at number 9, we have a phenomenon that turned neighbors into executioners and transformed European society into a paranoid nightmare: the Great Witch Hunts. What started as isolated cases of suspected witchcraft exploded into a continent-wide panic that claimed an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 lives over 3 centuries. The Renaissance witch hunts weren't medieval superstition. They were a thoroughly modern phenomenon, complete with legal procedures, scientific methods, and bureaucratic efficiency. The publication of Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, in 1487 essentially created a how-to manual for witch hunting, complete with torture techniques and legal justifications. The demographic pattern reveals the true horror. About 80% of the victims were women, often elderly, widowed, or otherwise vulnerable members of society. These weren't random accusations. They were systematic campaigns that eliminated society's most defenseless members under the guise of religious purity. But perhaps most diabolical was the swimming test. Suspected witches were bound and thrown into water. If they floated, they were guilty, because water rejected evil and would be burned alive. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent. Either way, they died. It was the perfect lose-lose situation. The economics of witch hunting created perverse incentives. Accused witches had their property confiscated, which funded the trials and enriched local officials. This created a feedback loop where successful witch hunters became wealthy, encouraging more accusations. Some regions developed entire bureaucracies dedicated to witch hunting, complete with specialized judges, torturers, and executioners. Perhaps most tragically, the witch hunts often targeted women with knowledge of herbal medicine, midwifery, or other traditional healing practices. Europe systematically eliminated generations of female medical knowledge, replacing it with male-dominated university medicine that was often less effective than folk remedies they destroyed. The hunts finally began to decline, not because of enlightenment, but because they had become too expensive and disruptive. Entire regions had been depopulated, and the paranoia was affecting wealthy and powerful families. The last official witch execution in Europe didn't occur until 1782, well into the supposed Age of Reason. At number 8, imagine half your neighbors swollen with black buboes, corpses dumped into plague pits, and the air thick with the smell of decay. Yes, the Renaissance was supposed to be about rebirth, but old medieval horrors refused to stay dead. While everyone remembers the original 14th century pandemic that killed a third of Europe, the plague's Renaissance sequels were equally terrifying and far more frequent than most people realize. The bubonic plague made a series of absolute devastating comebacks, returning in waves, striking cities like London, Florence, Milan, and Venice with terrifying regularity. Each time a plague wave came back, the city would lose 20 to 30% of its population in a matter of months, only to rebuild and face the horror all over again a generation later. These weren't just statistics. They represented the destruction of entire cultural networks, craft guilds, and artistic traditions that had taken centuries to develop and cultivate. For all its brilliance, the Renaissance couldn't outpaint or outphilosophize pestilence. The plague was the era's shadow, lurking at every banquet and marketplace. The wealthy would flee to country estates, abandoning entire cities to die, while the poor were literally walled into infected neighborhoods and left to starve or succumb to disease. Perhaps the most chilling was how plague became a tool of psychological warfare. During sieges, armies would catapult infected corpses over city walls, turning the disease into a weapon. The Renaissance dream of human progress and control over nature was repeatedly shattered by an invisible enemy that reminded everyone that death was still very much in charge. At number 7, we have an institution that turned religious persecution into a science, the Spanish Inquisition. While it lasted well beyond the Renaissance, its most creative and horrific methods were perfected during this period under the loving guidance of Tomás de Torquemada. Now, everyone expects the Spanish Inquisition. Wait, scratch that. No one expected the Spanish Inquisition. That was kind of the point. They would show up at your door without warning, armed with accusations of heresy and a toolbox that would make a medieval torturer weep with joy. Jews, Muslims, and heretics were dragged into its secret chambers, tortured until they confessed to whatever crimes the church wanted to hear. But the Inquisition's true genius wasn't in physical torture, it was in psychological warfare. They encouraged neighbors to spy on neighbors, children to inform on parents, and spouses to betray each other. They created a climate of paranoia where no one could be trusted. The Inquisition had what they called the Act of Faith, which was a public spectacle where heretics were burned alive. These weren't quick executions, they were elaborate theatrical performances designed to terrorize the populace. Victims wore yellow robes painted with demons and flames, and the whole city would turn out to watch them burn. The statistics are mind-numbing. Over 350 years, the Spanish Inquisition tried over 150,000 people and executed around 3,000 to 4,000. But the real damage was cultural. Entire communities of Jews, Muslims, and conversos were destroyed, their knowledge and contributions lost forever. Coming in at number 6 is an event that shows how quickly religious fervor can turn a cultural renaissance into a cultural genocide. Meet Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar who looked at Renaissance Florence and decided it needed a lot less art and a lot more hellfire. By the 1490s, Florence had suffered political upheavals, the death of Lorenzo de' Medici, and the looming threat of foreign invasion. The city was ripe for someone who promised answers. Savonarola reinvented himself as a prophet of doom. He preached that Florence was a new Jerusalem, chosen by God to lead the world, but only if it purges itself of sin. His sermons thundered with visions of apocalyptic fire, floods, and divine punishment. The irony is that the Medici had built Florence into a beacon of Renaissance culture. Then Savonarola convinced the same city to torch its luxuries in fear of eternal damnation, convincing the Florentines that their city was a modern Sodom and Gomorrah. His solution? Burn everything fun, beautiful, or remotely secular. In February of 1497, he organized the infamous Bonfire of the Vanities in the Piazza della Signoria. What went into these flames? Priceless paintings, sculptures, books, musical instruments, mirrors, cosmetics, fine clothing, and even chess sets, because apparently chess was the devil's game. Botticelli himself threw some of his own paintings into the fire, caught up in the religious hysteria. The destruction was catastrophic. Priceless works of art that had taken generations to create were reduced to ash in a matter of hours. The twist? Just 1 year later, the same people who had cheered the bonfires decided they'd had enough of Savonarola's extremism. In 1498, he was excommunicated, tortured, hanged, and then burned in the very same square where he had orchestrated his bonfires. The irony was lost on no one, but eventually his thunderous anti-papal rants crossed the wrong line. Pope Alexander VI, yes, Rodrigo Borgia, one of history's most corrupt popes, excommunicated him. Savonarola ignored it, doubling down. By 1498, Florence had grown weary of his Puritan dictatorship. Enemies seized their chance. He was arrested, tortured on the rack, and condemned as a heretic. And in poetic irony, he was burned at the stake in the very same piazza where he had ordered Florence's treasures consigned to the flames. As the flames consumed him, the crowd jeered. Florence traded one spectacle for another. A man who had tried to save their souls, now reduced to ashes. The Renaissance could build cathedrals of marble, but it also loved a good public barbecue. Coming in at number 5, we have a conflict that makes modern civil wars look like playground disputes. The French Wars of Religion lasted 36 years and turned France into a charnel house where brother fought brother, all in the name of God. This wasn't just about theology. It was about power, money, and centuries of pent-up social tensions exploding in the most violent way possible. Catholics and Huguenots, French Protestants, didn't just agree, they tried to exterminate each other with a creativity that would impress modern horror writers. The violence reached peaks of cruelty that shocked even contemporaries. In 1562, Catholic troops massacred 1,200 Huguenot civilians in Wassy, including women and children who had taken refuge in a barn that was then set on fire. In response, Protestant forces desecrated Catholic churches, destroying centuries of religious art and murdering priests on their own altars. The Siege of Orleans in 1563 saw both sides using civilians as human shields. Bodies of the dead were catapulted over city walls to spread disease. Prisoners were tortured for information, then executed in creative ways, hanging, burning, drowning, and being torn apart by horses. But perhaps the most horrific aspect was how the violence became normalized. Children grew up knowing no peace, and an entire generation was raised to see their neighbors as potential enemies. Families were split along religious lines, with fathers disowning sons and wives betraying husbands. The economic cost was devastating. Entire regions were depopulated, cities were burned, and France's position as a European power was severely weakened. By some estimates, the population dropped 20% during the conflict, and this was before gunpowder weapons reached their full potential. At number 4, slave trade. Picture this: 1441, Lagos, Portugal. Prince Henry the Navigator, celebrated in history books as a great explorer, is presiding over what might be the most consequential horror show in human history. Europe's first African slave auction. What started as a quest for gold and spices had morphed into something far more sinister: the systematic commodification of human beings on an industrial scale. But here's what makes this particularly dark for the Renaissance. This wasn't medieval barbarism. This was calculated, technologically advanced, bureaucratic evil. The Portuguese didn't stumble into slavery, they engineered it. Prince Henry established the world's first maritime slave trading operation, complete with purpose-built ships, standardized pricing, and meticulous record-keeping that treated human beings as inventory. The numbers are staggering and soul-crushing. Between 1441 and 1600, the Portuguese shipped an estimated 200,000 Africans into slavery, and this was just the beginning of what would become the largest forced migration in human history. But the raw statistics don't capture the true horror of how they systematized human suffering. What makes this even more chilling is how the Portuguese integrated slavery into Christian theology. They convinced themselves, and the Pope agreed, that enslaving Africans was actually a mercy because it introduced them to Christianity. The papal bull Dum Diversas of 1452 literally gave Portugal permission to subjugate Saracens, pagans, and other infidels, turning genocide into a holy mission. But here's the darkest irony. While Renaissance humanists were celebrating human dignity and potential, Portuguese traders were simultaneously creating systems that denied the humanity of millions. The same period that produced Michelangelo's David also produced slave ship blueprints designed to maximize human suffering. The Renaissance wasn't just about human achievement, it was also about perfecting human degradation on an unprecedented scale. This wasn't just the beginning of the Atlantic slave trade. It was the birth of modern racism, systematic dehumanization, and industrial-scale human trafficking. The Portuguese didn't just enslave people, they invented the concept of racial slavery that would poison the world for centuries to come. At number 3, we have an event that shocked Europe and marked the end of the High Renaissance, the sack of Rome. Picture this: the Eternal City, center of Christianity, home to the Pope, filled with the world's greatest art and architecture. Now imagine 20,000 angry, unpaid soldiers turning it into their personal playground of destruction. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V had a bone to pick with Pope Clement VII over political alliances. His solution? Send his troops to Rome to apply some pressure. The problem? These troops hadn't been paid in months and included a large number of Lutheran German soldiers who had some serious religious grievances with the Catholic Church. On May 6, 1527, these soldiers breached Rome's walls and all hell broke loose, literally. What followed was 8 days of uncontrolled violence that made previous sacks look like gentle disagreements. The soldiers didn't just loot, they desecrated. Cardinals were dragged through the streets in mock papal processions. Nuns were raped in their convents. Priests were tortured to reveal where treasures were hidden. The Sistine Chapel was turned into a stable, and soldiers used Raphael's frescoes for target practice. Pope Clement VII barely escaped with his life, fleeing through a secret passage to Castel Sant'Angelo, where he was besieged for weeks. From his refuge, he could hear the screams of his city being violated and smell the smoke of burning palaces. The cultural destruction was devastating. Priceless manuscripts were used as toilet paper. Ancient sculptures were melted down for their materials. Libraries built over centuries burned for warmth. It's estimated that Rome's population dropped from 55,000 to 10,000, and those who remained were traumatized survivors. The sack of Rome didn't just end the High Renaissance, it shattered the myth of papal invincibility and marked the beginning of Spanish dominance in Italy. Coming in at number 2, we have what might be the largest demographic catastrophe in human history: the European conquest of the Americas. Columbus's discovery in 1492 unleashed a century of violence, disease, and exploitation that wiped out entire civilizations and reduced the indigenous population by an estimated 90%. Let's start with the numbers, because they're absolutely staggering. When Europeans first arrived, the Americas were home to an estimated 50 to 100 million indigenous people. Within 150 years, that number had collapsed to around 5 to 10 million. We're talking about a death toll that makes every other entry on this list look like a minor skirmish. Christopher Columbus himself set the tone for what was to come. In his own journals, he described the Taino people of the Caribbean as gentle and generous, then immediately started planning how to enslave them. By 1496, he was shipping indigenous slaves back to Spain and had established a tribute system so brutal that thousands of natives committed suicide rather than comply. But Columbus was just the appetizer. Enter Hernán Cortés and his conquest of the Aztec Empire. With just 500 men, Cortés managed to topple an empire of millions, not through superior tactics, but through biological warfare he didn't even know he was waging. Smallpox, typhus, and other diseases devastated indigenous populations who had no immunity to European pathogens. The siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521 was particularly horrific. Cortés cut off the city's fresh water supply, forcing the Aztecs to drink from polluted canals. Bodies piled up so high in the streets that the Spanish had to burn them to prevent disease. When the city finally fell, Spanish soldiers massacred thousands of civilians, and Cortés ordered the complete destruction of Aztec temples, libraries, and artwork. Francisco Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire was even more treacherous. He invited the Inca emperor to a peaceful meeting, then kidnapped him and demanded a ransom of gold that filled an entire room. After receiving the ransom, Pizarro executed the Inca emperor anyway and proceeded to systematically destroy Inca civilization. Perhaps the most chilling aspect was how this genocide was justified. Spanish intellectuals seriously debated whether indigenous peoples had souls, while missionaries argued that destroying native religions was necessary to save them. The requirement, a legal document read to indigenous peoples before attacking them, essentially said, convert to Christianity and submit to Spanish rule, or we'll kill you, and it's your fault. The cultural destruction was as devastating as the physical genocide. The Spanish burned thousands of Maya codices, destroying centuries of astronomical, mathematical, and historical knowledge. They toppled temples, melted down golden artwork, and systematically eradicated indigenous languages and customs. What makes this even darker is how it's been sanitized in popular memory. We celebrate Columbus Day and talk about exploration and discovery as if the Americas were empty continents waiting to be claimed. The reality is that Renaissance Europe's expansion was built on the bones of entire civilizations. Coming in at number 1, we have one of history's most dramatic final acts, the fall of Constantinople. But to understand why this event sent shockwaves across the entire known world, we need to grasp what was actually ending here. This wasn't just another medieval siege, this was the death of the Roman Empire itself, over 2,000 years after its founding. Let's set the stage. The Byzantine Empire was literally the eastern half of the Roman Empire that had survived the fall of Rome in 476 AD. For nearly 1,000 years after the Western Empire collapsed, Constantinople, now known as Istanbul, had been the beating heart of Orthodox Christianity, the guardian of classical Greek and Roman knowledge, and the most magnificent city in the world. Constantinople wasn't just any city, it was the city. Built by Constantine the Great in 330 AD as the New Rome, it controlled the vital trade routes between Europe and Asia. Its triple walls had never been breached by enemy forces. It housed the world's largest cathedral, the most extensive libraries, and treasures that made medieval kings weep with envy. For over a millennium, it had been the one constant in a chaotic world, the city that simply could not fall. By 1453, the mighty Byzantine Empire had shrunk to essentially just Constantinople and a few surrounding villages. But the psychological impact of the city remained enormous. To Christians, it was the last bastion of the Eastern Church. To scholars, it was the repository of ancient wisdom. To everyone else, it was the city that had defied time itself. Enter Sultan Mahmud II, just 21 years old but already consumed with an obsession that would define his reign. He didn't just want to conquer Constantinople, he wanted to fulfill an 800-year-old Islamic prophecy and complete what Arab armies had failed to do since the 7th century. This wasn't just about territory, this was about claiming the mantle of Rome itself. On May 29, 1453, Constantinople, the legendary city that had withstood over 20 major sieges, finally faced its ultimate test. Mahmud has surrounded the city with 80,000 troops and the most advanced artillery the world had ever seen. Cannons so revolutionary they made medieval walls obsolete overnight. The siege itself was a masterpiece of technological warfare. Mahmud's massive cannon, the Basilica, was so large it required 60 oxen to move and could fire a 600-pound stone ball that shattered Constantinople's legendary walls. The sound was reportedly heard 10 miles away, and the psychological effect was devastating. For the first time in history, walls meant nothing. The death toll was staggering. An estimated 4,000 civilians were killed in the first day alone, with thousands more enslaved. But the psychological impact was even worse. The Ottomans didn't just conquer Constantinople, they systematically destroyed its Christian identity. The Hagia Sophia, Christianity's greatest cathedral and architectural wonder that had stood for nearly 1,000 years, was converted into a mosque. Christian frescoes were plastered over or defaced, and Islamic crescents replaced Christian crosses throughout the city. The cultural destruction was incalculable. Libraries containing thousands of ancient Greek and Roman texts that had survived the Dark Ages were burned or scattered. Artistic treasures accumulated over centuries were looted or destroyed. Monasteries that had preserved classical learning for over 1,000 years were converted or demolished. The intellectual continuity between the ancient and medieval worlds was forever severed. But here's what makes this particularly significant for the Renaissance. Many surviving Byzantine scholars fled to Western Europe, bringing with them classical texts that had been lost to the West for centuries. These refugees didn't just carry books, they carried living knowledge of ancient Greek language and philosophy. So while the fall of Constantinople was a catastrophe for Eastern Christianity, it had inadvertently supercharged the Renaissance. This is why 1453 is often considered the real end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the modern era. The fall of Constantinople didn't just end the Byzantine Empire, it ended the medieval worldview and ushered in the Renaissance mindset that nothing was permanent, everything was possible, and the future belonged to those bold enough to seize it. And there you have it, history lovers, the top 10 darkest moments of the Renaissance. The Renaissance taught us that humans are capable of both incredible beauty and unimaginable cruelty, sometimes in the same afternoon, sometimes by the same people. It's a lesson that remains relevant today. So, what do you think? Which of these dark moments shocked you the most? Did we miss any Renaissance horrors that deserve a mention? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this little stroll through the Renaissance's darkest corners, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and ring the bell so you never miss another scandalous dive into history. And until next time, keep exploring the epic, the beautiful, and yes, the absolutely terrifying world of the Renaissance.